Now, in this third study of Daniel, we shall be looking at the 5th and 6th chapters. The last lesson closed with the very strong profession by Nebuchadnezzar of the honor and glory of Daniel's God. And after this, Nebuchadnezzar dies, and his son after him rules, and this is to be the final period of the rule of the Babylonians. Now, in this section, we are given a view of the final days of the empire of Babylon, which had been so powerful, had crumpled so many other nations and kingdoms and peoples and cities that stood in the way of the ambitions of Nebuchadnezzar and those who followed him. We read here about a man named Belshazzar, who is described as the king. Now, we find out from history some interesting things. One is that the archaeologists at one point and the skeptics of the accuracy of biblical history had concluded that this obviously was an historical error, that there was never a King Belshazzar listed in the annals of the kings of Babylon, and they had what they considered to be rather complete records. Nevertheless, in recent years, archaeologists discovered that there was indeed a Belshazzar who never ruled as the sole king of Babylon, but who, when his father was away, was appointed and functioned as the king. And that it was while his father was away that the Persians invaded and overtook Babylon. And that explains something to us here when Belshazzar is offering a reward for one who can interpret the handwriting on the wall. He says, "I will make him third in the kingdom." The reason he offered him third place was that obviously he couldn't give the first place. That belonged to his father. The second place was his own. And so the third place in the kingdom is what he offered in his desperate attempts to decipher what was written by the hand on the wall. Now we will see these things develop and unfold as we go through our study today. Where I want us to begin is in the 5th chapter, in the 17th verse. We should understand that the handwriting on the wall has appeared while Belshazzar, who is second in the kingdom, but in command now in Babylon, while his father is away, while he's having a big party, throwing a great banquet for his friends and associates. And he is doing so in a way that dishonors God. We'll come back and look at all of that. But now he has called Daniel because his mother had told him that Daniel was a man with great wisdom. He calls Daniel in, and verse 17 of chapter 5 picks up at this point. Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let your gifts be to yourself." Remember, he had offered to make him third in the kingdom. To Daniel, this was not a very impressive offer. After all, Daniel already knew that the kingdom was going to end that night. It would hardly be a great reward to be made third in a kingdom that was about to crumble. Daniel said, keep your gift. I don't think I need that. But he said, nevertheless, I will read the writing to you, O king, and make known to him, the king, the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom and greatness and glory and majesty. Now we know how long it took Nebuchadnezzar to learn that God had given him this, that he didn't earn it, he didn't get it because of his own great ability and prowess, that it wasn't luck, that it wasn't politics, but that it was the sovereign God's determination to give him this kingdom and all the glory and greatness he had. And because of the greatness he gave him, all the peoples and nations trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and the glory was taken from him. Now, Daniel is talking about this humbling of Nebuchadnezzar that we studied about in the last hour, how he was brought down to have the sense of an animal and lived like an animal. Verse 21, he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast. His dwelling was with the wild asses, and he was fed with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, that he sets over it whomever he will. Now what Daniel does before he interprets the handwriting on the wall is go back and review the past. Now what he is saying is that your father finally learned what God was seeking to teach him. He finally came to acknowledge God Most High. He came to the point when he even made a proclamation to his people that there was no God like the God of Daniel. But now, having looked at the past, Daniel reviews for Belshazzar the present. Verse 22, you, his son, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. Incidentally, some people have been critical of the Bible here by saying that, the annals of the Babylonian history do not say anything about King Nebuchadnezzar being humbled and brought low, as the Bible says. And some of them say, see, this was really not part of true history. This was made up by the Bible writers, by Daniel. We find, though, clear evidence that continually subsequent rulers have erased from the records things that were embarrassing, things that would not look good on the record for the kings of the different empires. The pharaohs, for instance, continually chipped off history that was written about them that they didn't like, and they eliminated it. The evidence of their covering it over is clear. It was not to the interest of the people that succeeded that this account of Nebuchadnezzar should be retained. And so when he died, no matter what proclamations he made, it would be eliminated. and only what they wanted in the record, all his glorious triumphs, not his dealings with God, would be what was left. But Daniel says, you knew all this happened, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And you brought the vessels of God's house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them. Now these were the vessels for the Lord's house. They were for the priest. They were to be used only in connection with the laws and sacrifices that God had given to his people. This man, his father, originally Nebuchadnezzar, who was actually this man's grandfather, originally Nebuchadnezzar had captured all those things, the treasures of the temple, and he had carried them back to Babylon. We're not told what he did with them. Probably they were simply put aside. But this man, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, is so exalted in his own heart that he takes these and deliberately profanes them as if to mock the God of Daniel and to some extent probably to mock the God whom his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had acknowledged. You have drunk wine from them and praised the gods of silver and gold, which see not nor hear not, and the God in whose hand your breath is, and whose are all your ways, you have not glorified. So here again we have a case of the truth of what Paul said in Romans 1. Rather than worship God the Creator, sinful man in his sinful heart will worship the creatures rather than the Creator. They would worship their own gods of silver and gold and brass and iron and praise them and use the sacred things of the true God as a means of profaning the name of God. In all of this, then, you have not glorified God. And it's for that reason the hand was sent before you and the writing was inscribed. You would not learn from the past. You would not learn from what God did to your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. And you have, again, as a ruler, proudly and vainly dishonored his name. This, then, is the writing. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the theme. Mene means God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. Now, the king did not need for Daniel to tell him that mene meant numbered. This was the language that he knew. He understood the words. He could read the words. And he knew that what it said up there was numbered. But what Daniel tells him is, this means God, the sovereign God, has numbered your kingdom. What is being numbered here is your kingdom. God is now balancing the books on your kingdom. The numbers are all in. The figures have been added, and they don't add up. And therefore, he has brought it to an end. Tekel, again, the word means weighed. It was a common Semitic word that appears in Babylonian, it appears in Aramaic, it appears in Hebrew, many of the Semitic languages which were akin. And it means weighed, tekel. But what he is saying here is that the meaning of this word which you saw written on the wall is that you are weighed. You are weighed in the balance, and you are found wanting. Two things. The accounts have been figured up, they've been added up, and they're out of balance. Also, you have been weighed in the scales of God's justice and righteousness. You have been weighed, and you're all out of balance. You're found wanting. You simply don't measure up to God's standards. Paris, divided. The word he knew. Numbered, weighed, divided. That's what it looked like on the wall. And as he read it, that's what it said. He didn't know what it meant. But he's told here what it meant. Verse 28, your kingdom is divided. It's cut up in little pieces. It's given to the Medes and the Persians. This was a somber day for Belshazzar. And what it meant was that the day of the Lord for his kingdom had come. The day of the Lord in the Bible is a very meaningful term. We see it probably earliest in the writing of Joel when he talks about the day of the Lord that's about to come on Judah if the people do not repent of their evident sin. The day of the Lord is spoken of by the prophets over and over about the particular time when God is ready to judge any kingdom, any nation. Now, we know that kingdoms and nations come at a certain time in history. There is no Babylonian kingdom today. There is no Roman Empire today. They're past history. And there will never be another kingdom like that. That kingdom is gone. Now, God judges kingdoms in human history. They rise according to God's will. They appear on history, the record of history, and we can go back and read of them. They go along, and then they disappear. They end. They are no more. And the day of the Lord is when God says, this kingdom is no longer of any use to me. And that's the message, you see, that is coming to the king of Babylon. God is saying, your end is come. Belshazzar heard this solemn pronouncement. Evidently, he didn't take it seriously. It says that he said, well, clothe Daniel with purple and a chain of gold and make a proclamation that he is to be the third ruler in the kingdom. Obviously, he didn't take seriously what was said. In a sense, perhaps he was mocking Daniel by saying, okay, you've made this prophecy. Now I'm going to keep my promise, and I'm going to make you third in a kingdom that you say is going to end very shortly. But in fact, it does end that very night. On verse 30, we read, "In that night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain." The very man who had drunken vessels with his drunken companions just a few hours before, that very night he was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So what we see here then is the fact that Belshazzar could not learn from the past. He was not able to apply the lessons of the past to his own presence and therefore honor God. And because of this, the day of the Lord for him came, and the end of the Babylonian Empire. Now, Darius, verse 1 of chapter 6, now became ruler not only over his own domains, but over the extended empire that he conquered in taking over the Babylonian Empire. And that reached, of course, all the way down to the area that had been controlled by the Romans, the Babylonian Empire in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. It included all the way down to Egypt, all of Palestine, all of what had formerly been Israel and Judah. Some great things happened at this time. We are told that Cyrus, who was the overruling king of that day, Cyrus, who was the king of the Persians, in this alliance between the Medes and the Persians, Darius ruled the Medes. But Cyrus was over both the Medes and the Persians because he had combined the two empires into one. And he's not mentioned here, but in the accounts that we have in the book of Ezra and at the end of Chronicles, Cyrus, as soon as he became king, gave command that the Israelites should be set free and should go back to their homeland, that they should build the temple of the Lord there, which Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed. And so we see again the sovereignty of God at work. His people had to bear up under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar and his successors for 70 years while they lived in captivity. But as a new king, a new empire was established, God worked through that new king to give them back their land and their temple and ultimately their walls. And the city and the people were reestablished with one difference. They themselves were not a kingdom. And as Ezra and others acknowledged in their day, that because of their sins against God, though they had come back to that land, they still served those who were over them, now the Medes and the Persians. God continued to bless Daniel, and we're told that in the organization there in the area of the Babylonian Empire, or the former Babylonian Empire, that Darius appointed 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one. And we're told in verse 3, this Daniel was distinguished above the presidents and the satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over the whole realm. Daniel was lifted to a very high position, even higher than he had had under Nebuchadnezzar. And all of this because Daniel had been faithful in a little thing. And God began to bless his faithfulness in that which God had committed into his hands, and he multiplied his responsibilities, brought him to this position in the kingdom. Now we're going to see that this did not mean the end of Daniel's problems. And we will also see, as we look further, that God still had much to teach about his sovereignty to the kings of this world. But going back now to the 5th chapter, in its beginning, we shall see how these matters progressed, as there was a great transition, a day of the Lord for Babylon. Now, God was pleased to use Persia to accomplish his purpose, and they overthrew Babylon. But one day there would be a day of the Lord for Persia as well. Remember the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, that image representing the first king in a line of 4 great empires. The first empire, that of the Babylonians. When that failed, when the day of the Lord came for that empire, then came the empire of the Persians. That was the silver. And then when that empire failed God and was no longer useful to him, then it was the day of the Lord for the Persians, and the Greeks came and took over under the leadership of one we know as Alexander the Great. And he extended his empire as far and beyond what the Persians had ruled. And that empire came to an end also. And there are things in the writings of Daniel later that we will see that show why that empire came to an end, as it also defied the living God. And then finally came the Roman Empire, which would bring, in God's purpose, the day of the Lord for the Greeks. And Rome would reign supreme, and it was the greatest of all empires. But it was at that time that God established his kingdom and began to bring down ultimately all the kingdoms of the world. But that, of course, is history future. Now looking at chapter 5, Belshazzar made a great feast, and he invited thousands to this feast. Celebrating there, he brought out the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had brought from the temple in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from it. We note in verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver and brass and iron, of wood and stone. We see that this is what angered God. This is what brought that day of the Lord on that kingdom. In that same hour, the fingers of a man's hand wrote on the plaster of the wall, and the king, we're told, his countenance changed. His thoughts troubled him. The joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. He was scared to death. It's not hard to understand why. If we suddenly saw a hand writing here, I suspect we would be frightened. It's not your usual everyday occurrence. But when it came on him, he cried aloud. And immediately he demanded that all the wise men of Babylon come, and whoever could read the interpretation, he made to them this rather ludicrous offer, as it turned out, that that person would be the third ruler in the kingdom. But nobody could read and interpret the writing. Now, as I say, they could read the writing, they could read the words, but it was just words. Numbered, weighed, and divisions. Well, what did that say? None of them was even clever enough, evidently, to make up a meaning that would satisfy the king. And so the people remained frustrated. But the queen, the mother of Belshazzar, had more sense. She had seen undoubtedly many of the things that had taken place in Nebuchadnezzar's rule, and she said to the king, "O king, live forever. Don't let your thoughts trouble you. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods." Now note, their theology is bad. They're talking about gods, a plurality of gods. They were not able to take the truth that God revealed in demonstrating his sovereignty and truly relate it to truth about God. But at least she knew that there was a man named Daniel whose God was effective. And she reviews what he did in the days of Nebuchadnezzar and how Nebuchadnezzar had honored him and given him a high position, and he had been able to interpret many mysteries for Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the fact that she is explaining all this would indicate that Daniel at this particular time was not in very good standing with the present Belshazzar. He apparently knew little about Daniel, though he, according to Daniel, had learned about the way Nebuchadnezzar had been humbled and had not taken that seriously. So Daniel is brought in, as we're told here. And again, like Nebuchadnezzar before him, he says in verse 14, "I've heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." Actually, he had just heard about these things, but he acted as though, "Now I know this, and I want you to come, and I want you to give an interpretation. Can you interpret this and dissolve doubts?" Now, if you can interpret what it means, then I will make you third ruler in the kingdom. Well, that was a proposition that was put before Daniel, and we have seen how Daniel handled that. We have seen that he began with a stern rebuke against this king who refused to learn from the past, and that in the present he had failed God. He had learned nothing from the past experiences of the rulers of Babylon, and therefore that God was going to bring the kingdom to an end. And we saw how that indeed did happen. Now, going on to the rest of what's in chapter 6, beginning in verse 4 of that chapter, the presidents that worked with Daniel after he was made one of three and really made the most distinguished of the presidents. Obviously, this worked jealousy in the heart of these other rulers, these Persians, these Medes, who felt that they should be in the top positions. And so we're told that they sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. Their idea was, if we can find where this man is failing to serve the king, if we can find that he is doing his job in such a way that it is not acceptable, then we can go and accuse him to the king. We can say, this man's not doing his job. He's not looking out for the best interest. This Jew that you have exalted here is a man who is not looking out for the best interest of the empire, the kingdom. Now, by this means, then, they hope to get him replaced by one of them. Of course, the scramble would have then been on which one of them would take his place. But that's the way things were done in that day. Now, note the significance of this statement. They could find no occasion, no fault, because he was faithful. Neither was there any error or fault found in him. Now, just pause and think for a moment. This is what I'm saying about our service to God. we must understand that wherever God has put us, that is where He wants us. That job, whatever our talents and abilities, whatever job we have gotten, that we do day by day,